Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, it looks like everyone survived lunch. Well, I guess everyone who survived came back, and maybe others didn't survive. I learned long ago that you can't wait till everyone's back to start again because people don't come back until you start. So I'm going to start. We're going to change gears now, and we're going to start taking full advantage of the 3 workshops that we had this week. Man, tough crowd. Where's the bell? So earlier this week, we had 3 workshops, an Indigenous Water Justice workshop, an Environmental Water workshop, and a Drought in Federal Rivers workshop. And those workshops were the vehicle for getting all our speakers that are here at the conference today. That was the workshops were the vehicle for getting them here. And so while on one hand, I'm, I guess, technically the organizer of this conference, it is the folks that put together the workshops that did all the work and that organized the sessions that you're going to be hearing from now on out. And so this seems like a really good time for me to thank those people since they did all the work here. The Indigenous Water Justice Workshop was primarily organized by Jason Robeson, and Charles Wilkinson already pointed him out this morning. And he got a lot of help. Deb Donahue, Larry McDonald, others. I'll get around to some others here. The Drought in Federal Rivers workshop was primarily the creation of Dustin Garrett and Lucia DiStefano, and you'll hear from them tomorrow. But now you're going to hear from the person who was primarily responsible for organizing the environmental workshop, Sue Jackson. And Sue will very quickly point out that there was several people involved, but all those people that were involved, I think, are on the panel, so you'll get a chance to meet those people as well. And so my thanks to them and to all those people within their networks that they leaned upon. It was the key to getting people here and to making this thing work. So with that, I will hand it over to Sue, who's going to run this session this afternoon, and then we'll have a break, and then we'll have Jason's session. So I think there's very little for me to do from now on, except to say, Sue, maybe I'll say one sentence of introduction, is an associate professor at the Australian Rivers Institute at Griffith University in Queensland. And I guess that's it. Sue.
Thanks. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Well, welcome to this session today this afternoon on environmental flows and people. So we're part of an initiative that's trying to make more explicit the connections between healthy river systems and the human communities that depend on those systems, their livelihoods and their ways of life, cultures and values. Now, but as well as thanking Doug and others at the law school here, I also want to, on behalf of my colleagues, acknowledge the traditional owners, the Aboriginal peoples of the region that we're meeting on today. And we had a very generous welcome on Monday from a member of the Arapaho tribe, so thank you very much. And what we're going to do today is structure this session where we have 4 speakers. Rebecca Tharm is going to provide an introduction, an introductory 15 minutes that will provide a framework and an overview for 4 case studies to follow. We're going to have a 15-minute presentation from Rebecca, and then each of the case studies will take 15 minutes. We'll have a couple of questions after each of the case studies, and then if we manage our time well, we should have about 10 minutes for general questions and discussion at the end. So I'll hand over to Rebecca Tharm, who's the Director of River Futures, to give us an overview and introduction to the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be here at the law school for the first time and to be a part of this event, and an opportunity to talk about something we've been thinking about for a number of years now, and that is how to better integrate social and ecological sciences in the improvement of environmental water management, particularly in relation to environmental flows. And we'll go through a number of case studies on the topic. But first of all, just have a background, as Sue said, on what we've termed environmental flows in the era of river anthropology, just in this era where we really are considering social sciences integration more explicitly in some of the environmental water topics. I think everyone in this room is very aware now that rivers are social ecological systems. And when we're thinking about water management, we've had a lot of conversation this morning around the bottom end of this picture, really, around the water uses by people, around the sectoral demands, cross-sectoral demands, and how that relates to the availability of physical availability of water and how that water is managed in time and space. So I think we're all quite familiar with the flow timing and pattern, low flow needs of rivers, high flow needs of these systems. But what we'd like to talk about now a little bit is the social and ecological assets and importance and value of these systems. When we're talking about water, we really are talking about more than just the water resource. We're talking about the ecosystems that underpin that resource. And if we think about the flow regime, the flow dynamics, we're thinking about the role that that variable has in influencing the physical habitat of these systems, the quality of the water, the connectivity among the different parts of these systems, the supply of energy, the interactions among species and components, and how that all comes together to really ensure the ecological integrity and the long-term resiliency of our rivers and other kinds of wetland systems. And also, of course, the flow regime and its interactions with these other biophysical components we know is actually very important for ensuring we can supply ecosystem services. I think it's no surprise in this room that we know that hydrological alteration, as we've progressively managed our water resources to meet human needs, has driven ecosystem change. We know that that's through the presence of physical or soft thermal or sediment, other barriers in the system. It can be through the loss of the connectivity between the rivers and floodplains. And it's also very much to do with the changes in the pattern and timing of flows. If you look at the Flamingo Gorge option, the blue line is the natural pattern of that flow regime. And you can imagine the system, in terms of the social system and the ecological system, has evolved to relate and to intimately connect with this blue line. And after Flamingo Gorge Dam operation, we see a very different pattern and timing of flows related to hydropower delivery and other water resources needs downstream. Similarly, with new infrastructure projects like the Susitno hydropower project in Alaska, we can see there might be quite radical changes in flow regime, even at the temporal scale of within each day. And we can imagine that those changes from the natural, those departures from the natural system over time have really going to influence the responses of both ecosystems and the livelihoods and other dependencies of people who have evolved together in these environments. We know that this hydrologic alteration has, at a global level, really resulted in some shocking levels of decline in both the health and the biodiversity of freshwater systems, far more so than for any other kind of ecosystem on the planet. That decline has been extremely rapid in populations of species. More than 3/4 of populations are declining at an incredibly fast rate. We know that as infrastructure, numbers of dams have increased, we've lost the numbers of free-flowing rivers we have that are in fairly good condition. And we know already that the preceding hydraulic infrastructure development has had this major impact of biodiversity. When we look to the future, we see in the orange bar here, we have a forecasting of a reinvigoration of infrastructure development, and we can expect further declines potentially in species if we don't, and ecosystems, if we don't think about how we manage our water resources in a more environmentally sustainable way. We know there have been impacts on the ecosystem services, the livelihoods of people and human well-being, perhaps not as well documented, although we now have a number of studies across the world that show losses, significant losses of various kinds of ecosystem services, from provisioning services like freshwater and fisheries, right through to some of the cultural services, sacred sites, recreational opportunity, and so on. In one of the only analyses really at large scale done a few years ago, there was an assessment of downstream impacts, downstream of infrastructure projects, what have been the likely impacts on the livelihoods of people. And with the estimation is around 2 billion people dependent on those ecosystems, and about upwards of 500 million of those people already impacted or at serious risk of altered livelihoods from infrastructure development. That's a conservative estimate based on very poor data sets at the global level. We also know that we're going to get great impacts and benefits from this infrastructure, this new phase of infrastructure development in the future. If we think just about hydropower, we look here at the hydropower projections globally, existing dams in blue, under construction orange, planned ones in red. The green, the very dark areas of the world are where we have very high biological diversity based only on our understanding of freshwater fish and the fisheries that people depend on in these basins. We know that 70% of the future build-out, and we're looking in the order of 9,000 dams by 2050, that's the projection, that 70% of that's going to happen in these places where we know something at least about how those developments will impact downstream ecosystems. But the question is, what do we know about how it will affect the livelihoods and the cultural ties of people who live along those rivers? So that brings us to environmental flows. And it was great to hear this topic come up so much in the conversation this morning. There's an enormous awareness now around environmental flows internationally and in almost every country, I would say, across the world. And when we're defining it, we're really thinking about the quantity, the timing, and also the quality of water flows and water levels to sustain freshwater and estuarine ecosystems. But very importantly, also the human livelihoods and well-being that depend on those ecosystems. And to think about living in this rhythm of the waters as this new move around river culture is encouraging us to do. So although a lot of the science, a lot of the understanding and the discussion has been around the ecological sides of environmental flows, we're now trying through this meeting and through other discussions to really bring forward this understanding on human livelihoods and well-being. If we think about the evolution of environmental flows, then we started, as we discussed this morning, with we had lots of examples of the engineering era of thinking water resource development for society, minimum flows for diluting pollution in the 1940s through to the 70s. We then started to have this attention on economically and socially important fisheries, salmonid fisheries, the evolution of the first methods that relied purely on hydrological flow records to set estimates of how much water might be needed to maintain ecosystems for their maintenance or for pollution control or for salmonid fisheries predominantly. We then moved into an ecological era where we started to think about environmental flow regimes for whole ecosystems. South Africa, Australia particularly, and some other countries were really challenged by thinking about flows to maintain not only iconic or high conservation or economically valuable fisheries or species, but really whole ecosystems, particularly in areas where there were these strong ties between human communities and ecosystem health. Also a challenge increasingly to work in these data-deficient contexts. So the first holistic or whole ecosystem kinds of methods were born in this era, in the ecological era. And we've now moved into a time where we're quite familiar with using these kinds of methods. We have quite good grounding in the ecological, hydroecological knowledge and underpinning, and we're now trying to integrate more explicitly the values of people and nature into this discussion around flows, and to scale up our environmental flow understanding to regions. So taking what we know from our project-by-project assessments of flow needs, or what we know is allowing, the national legislation is allowing us to do, and really bringing that together and scaling up. We're much more explicitly engaging in stakeholder discussions and trade-off analysis with stakeholders. We're now thinking about the allocation mechanisms for environmental water and really how to be more effective at using those. And of course, we're dealing with novel ecosystems, climate adaptation response, and novel sectors, humanitarian and development sectors particularly, who are grappling with some of the more challenging developing world issues around water. Our scientific knowledge over the years of working on environmental flows has allowed us to understand what the relationships are between ecological response and different components of the flow regime. If you think about the pale gray as the flow regime in a river that's in fairly good shape, and the dark gray as what we'd like to try and motivate to keep in place as that river becomes increasingly developed for human uses. And we can start to say, based on our conceptual and our practical understanding in different places, which are the more or less critical flow events to have in place and why from an ecological perspective. But we're more challenged when it comes to articulating that from a social one. As I said, the holistic, the socio-ecological area has really put a lot of attention on interdisciplinary science, and those interdisciplinary teams that work in this area have increasingly included social sciences, whether it's resource economists perhaps in the beginning, but also social anthropologists, people working in livestock and human health issues, and so on. So we have really an interdisciplinary team mindset in terms of how to really come together and solve these problems around environmental water. And we've used these interdisciplinary processes to build understanding conceptually and practical understanding in different river basins of the relationships between the dynamics of the flow regime. There's the blue is the pre-development flow regime in this particular system in the US, where 90% now of the water has been taken off for irrigation. And the yellow is the current situation. And we can start to understand the relationships not only with in-stream fish and other in-stream organisms, but also the vegetation along the river corridors and so on, how those different components of the system are linked or were linked to this blue regime, the natural one, and how they're coping or how they're responding in terms of the altered flow regime. So we build these relationships up in the environmental flow process. So how far have we got then with actually doing that with building in more the social sciences information? And we'll talk more through the case studies on this. I just wanted to show a couple of examples that we won't get to talk about today. In the Ganges, in Upper Ganges Basin, we heard about some of the really intractable problems in India in terms of the legislation and policy environment, politics around water. In the Ganges, there's been environmental flow studies that have integrated the cultural services, ritual bathing, the ghats along the river corridors, spiritual values and beliefs into the assessments of environmental flows for the Mother Ganga, for this iconic system in the continent. In the Nam Songkhram Basin, a sub-basin of the Mekong in Thailand, there's been Thai-Ban research, a special kind of community-based research where local communities have been actively participating in developing the flow recommendations, identifying where are the critical parts of the ecosystem to focus attention, what are their critical resources for people, and how those relate to the natural flow dynamics of the river and its role in the broader context of the Mekong River system. In the Magdalena Basin in Colombia, there is a lot of work in the floodplain complexes of the lower basin at the moment to link the life cycles of fish to the hydrological patterns of the wetland. But there are big challenges in understanding in terms of the cultural, the communities from the upper basin that even anthropologists know very little about, in terms of understanding how those cultures evolved in relation to the river ecosystem and its health. And in the US, of course, quite a lot of experience that came out this morning around how recreational and salmoniid fishery values to tribal nations and other examples are key elements of ongoing flow restoration efforts or even dam retrofits and decommissioning processes. So just to set the stage, I think, for the case studies and for the discussion that's really an ongoing one at the moment, we know that there's been an exponential growth in environmental flows over the past 15 years, really concentrated on establishing and scaling up our understanding of eco-hydrology. But the vital social dimensions of the scientific understanding, the knowledge, and the practice have lagged behind. They're weakly developed at the moment, and they're disconnected from these efforts. Also, we know that there is knowledge on human dependencies on flow regimes, but it's scant and it's quite dispersed, and we may not have captured it. It's out there, but it's very highly dispersed at the moment. There are few institutional bridges at the moment that link the social sciences community to the natural sciences community in the area of environmental flows specifically. And it's also rather a neglected topic still, we feel, in terms of the international policy arena on environmental water and sustainability and water resources management. But what we wanted to start the session by saying is that efforts to address this are really underway. They're gaining momentum, and this is what we mean by the area of river anthropology. We're really making a proactive effort to bring those disciplines together and to really move into a more sustainable future that takes into regard the needs of the ecosystems and the needs of the people that depend on them. So I'll leave it there, and thank you. We're not going to have questions at this stage. We're going to move straight into the case study, starting with North Australia, an example. Thank you very much.
So we will have time for questions at the end of the session. So I'd like to ask Michael Douglas Professor Michael Douglas to come up to the stage now. Michael is a Professor in Environmental Science at the University of Western Australia, and he's going to be talking about case studies from North Australia.
Thanks, Sue, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be here today, Doug. Oops. Nope. Nope. Is it this one? Yep. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about food for thought, water requirements for social ecological systems, and I'm focusing on the wet-dry tropics in Northern Australia. I did this work with Sue Jackson. And so the area that I'm talking about is the area that's shaded there in light brown in Northern Australia. It's the wet-dry tropics part. And that area covers about 55 major river basins, and combined area of those river basins is nearly 500,000 square miles. So it's about 4.5 times the size of Colorado, but it's very different in terms of population. There's only 300,000 people living in that entire area, and 100,000 of them live in one city. So we have a population density across that vast area of far less than 1 person per square mile. One of the other features of the population is that it's about 30% of the population are Aboriginal people. And Aboriginal people have legal ownership of about 30% of the land, and they've been managing most of the rest of the country up there for tens of thousands of years using traditional knowledge and practices. The other thing that defines the region in the wet-dry tropics is the climate. We have a highly seasonal pattern of rainfall, and so we have a very short but intense wet season in which 80% of the 65 inches of rain falls just in the first 3 months of the year, and then that's followed by really a seasonal drought. We have 5 or 6 months where we have little or no rainfall, and temperature-wise it's just hot all the time. So that means that during the dry season, most of the river systems dry up to either just a series of disconnected pools, or the vast majority, in fact, dry up completely every year. But then when the wet season starts, we have vast storms over the floodplains, and then eventually the river systems fill up and start to flow, and then flood out over tens of thousands of square miles of floodplains. So there's a lot of water up there in the wet season. And in fact, there's a lot of water up there in general. Northern Australia, those 55 catchments make up about 50% of the total river flows from the whole country, and that's about 160 million acre-feet. And the other thing to note about that water is that across those 55 river basins, only 2 of them have large rivers. And so more than 99.9% of the water in those river systems flows freely from the headwaters down out to the seas. And so that's quite different to many of the other river systems that we've talked about today. And because of that abundance of water, there's been some real interest in developing Northern Australia. And it's not a new thing. Developing that part of Northern Australia has been on the agenda for about 100 years. And it seems that every 20 or 30 years, people rediscover the north and then make attempts at trying to develop the north. The current phase of development really builds on the sorts of issues that Tony talked about in his talk. 10 years ago, Australia was gripped by the biggest drought on record, and because of that severe drought, people started looking at the watery part of North Australia again. Their eyes were going north and looking at what we might do about making use of that landscape. And since then, the pressure hasn't let up. It's become something of a national imperative. The national government has put out a statement, a white paper about developing Northern Australia, and new government departments, both state and federal, have been set up to develop Northern Australia. So that's our link really to the water scarcity, is that it's water scarcity in the southern part of the country that's driving the pressure to develop the north. And the rhetoric around developing the north is very much framed around the production of food. And it goes along the lines that Australia needs to have food security. In order to guarantee food security, agriculture needs water security. Southern Australia, as Tony mentioned in his talk, we have drought, there's declining rainfall projected as a result of climate change into the future, and the water that's down there is already largely over-allocated. In the north, we've got ample land, and the water is being wasted. That's the general wisdom. And what it should be is being a food bowl for the rest of the region. And periodically over the last 100 years, it's been listed as a potential food bowl for the region. We're very close to Asia, and they see us as the food bowl for Asia. But we're a long way short of that goal at the moment. If you look at agriculture at the moment, there's only 80 square miles of irrigated land. It generates something like $160 million a year, largely from watermelons, mangoes, and more recent crops such as chia. But there's potential to expand on that. And that's what interests people. So the Australian government commissioned the National Science Organisation to do an assessment of what the agricultural potential for the region might be. And in their report, Unlocking the Potential of Northern Australia, they identified that groundwater resources in the region could support a further 230 square miles of new irrigation land, and that putting in dams across the region could support a further 5,500 square miles of new irrigated land. And if that 5,500 square miles of new irrigated land came online, that would represent something like a 50% increase in the total irrigated area in Australia. So it's figures like that that have really got people excited, particularly developers and agriculturalists, really excited about the potential of Northern Australia. But it's figures like that that have got other people, such as us, really worried about what's going on in Northern Australia, particularly because in that report, buried in there was some pretty serious provisos around those figures. The first is that they said that those figures were unconstrained by the regulatory environment. So, for example, some of the potential new irrigation land includes areas that are national parks. In fact, the largest national park in Australia, it's World Heritage listed for biological and cultural significance. It still comes up as part of the potential new irrigation land. And it also ignores the fact that we have mandatory environmental flows. And it didn't take into account other users or other uses of water, which seems crazy. That's the sort of thinking that got us into these sorts of problems in the Murray-Darling Basin, and we hope to avoid a $10 billion repair bill that Tony talked about paying at the moment. So who are those other users, and what are their uses of the water? Well, for about the last 10 years, we've been leading a program of new research to try and get ahead of the game. Before the big decisions are made in Northern Australia about allocating water and land, can we get sufficient information in there to inform good decision making to avoid the sorts of problems that most of the talks have really featured today? And that's the work that we'll be featuring. In doing that, we brought together a team of social scientists, hydrologists, ecologists, economists, so Poling Tan, Sue Jackson, we're all part of this team. It's been a great privilege working with people. And as a process of that, we've uncovered the fact that it's not just about agriculture when we're talking about this issue of food security in Northern Australia. There's a whole lot of hidden components to the food production systems that are really just not taken into account. One of those is food production in seafood and the reliance of that on rivers. There's a commercial fishery in the north that's worth about $220 million a year. That's based around a couple of species of fish, prawns and mud crabs. Now, the prawns are caught hundreds of kilometres offshore. The mud crabs are caught in the sea edge of the river systems, in the estuaries, and the fish are all netted out in the estuaries. So they're not really considered part of the freshwater part of the system, and yet research over the last 10 years has shown a striking reliance of those seafood fisheries on the flows from the river systems. So this sort of pattern where you have water use on an indication of rainfall on the x-axis at the bottom, and then some indication of the production of the fishery on the other side. You can see the pattern is that as we get increased rainfall or river flows, we get increased catches of mud crabs in this case, or freshwater prawns. And these prawns are hundreds of kilometres offshore, but more water coming out of the rivers means more prawns for the industry. And we see the same thing for Barramundi. Now, Barramundi, the black line shows a measure of recruitment into the fishery, so how many fish are breeding that year. And again, you can see it tracks the pattern of rainfall and river flows from the system. So it's been a really important discovery to show that there's a very strong relationship between the water coming out of those rivers and more water equals more seafood. It's a very simple equation. Now that's for the commercial part of the fishery, but probably a really important part of the fishery is the recreational component. It was worth at least $50 million a year, and it's built largely around one species, the barramundi. Barramundi is a lot like your salmon in the sense that it relies on, it breeds down in the estuary, it has to migrate up into the freshwater part of the system and then migrate back down into the estuary and the oceans to breed. It's also highly targeted by tourists. About half of the tourists that come to the north, and that's $1 billion industry, do so with the aim of catching a barramundi. So progressively, governments have been buying up the commercial fishing licences to reduce the amount of competition with the recreational anglers. And again, we see these relationships between the recreational catch, the chance of a tourist actually catching a fish also increases with the amount of the water that's coming out of those rivers each year. So that's the commercial and the recreational catch, and it's usually non-Indigenous people involved in that. But as I said, the region's very strong Indigenous population, and work that Sue Jackson and others have been doing has really been showing that Aboriginal people are really reliant very much on the products from those river systems. So it's not just fish, it's not just prawns, it's the birds, the magpie geese and the eggs that they lay, and also things such as lotus lilies and turtles. And in fact, the work that Sue did showed that Aboriginal people are harvesting typically nearly 60 species from these river systems, but that there's, in most cases where we looked, there was 10 species that accounted for about 90% of the total value of that catch. And this is data from just one of the river systems, from the Daly River Basin, and it shows the amount of fish and resources that are harvested from these river systems, and the dark grey lines show how much is harvested, the light grey lines show how much is consumed. And there's three things to take away from this. The first is just the diversity of species that are being harvested. There's turtles, there's plants, there's fish, there's birds. There's a great diversity, and each of those have different water requirements. The other thing is that barramundi, the most important recreational and commercial fish, is way down on the list. So protecting the flows just for barramundi will not account for the needs of Aboriginal people. And the third thing is that the difference between what's harvested and what's consumed is really the social benefit. That's the fish that is shared among the community, that's traded between communities, and really represents the extent to which this activity is part of the social fabric and part of these people's lives. Now, the total value of that catch seems quite modest. The fortnightly consumption value is only, say, $100 per household, but you have to put that in the context of some of the most impoverished people in Australian society. That $100 a week represents 5% of household income, and it represents nearly a quarter of all the food that's consumed in that household. So it's a very important subsidy. And Indigenous households are under financial stress. 30% of all households have difficulty paying for just the basic needs, and nearly a quarter of households include people who go without when the food runs out. They don't have the money to buy more. So having those wild harvests is a really important resource. Now, all of these things that I've talked about, the fisheries, the Indigenous harvest, the commercial and recreational harvest, they're all the products of healthy ecosystems. And a lot of the work that we've been doing is trying to understand what's the basis of the food source for those ecosystems, because that food production, that ecosystem food production, underpins these other parts of the food production system. And we found that if you look at something like a barramundi, and typically people will catch these upstream, say 100 kilometres upstream of the estuary, 6 months after the floodplains have dried up, and even though that fish is in the river, only 20% of the meat on that fish was actually derived from the time in the river. Instead, 35% of it came from the 6 weeks or so that the floodplains held water. So those floodplains are very short-lived wet cycle phenomenon, but they're incredibly productive. They're the hotspots of production. And about half of the flesh comes from the time that the fish spends in the estuary. So that tells us that we have to maintain enough water in these systems to get sufficient water out on the floodplains to fuel the energy in these systems, but we have to have water in the dry season to allow the fish to move upstream and downstream through those systems. So what it means is that in our typical landscape there, it's not just about agricultural food production. That's really important, and it's happening in the upper parts of the catchments, but as you move downstream and sometimes way offshore, we've got these other parts of the food cycle, the food production system, commercial fisheries, recreational fisheries, Aboriginal people harvesting throughout the river system, and then that ecosystem food production, particularly on the floodplains, is vitally important. So if we want to increase horticulture, we can do that. We can do that, and it's usually in the upper parts of the river systems, but it usually relies on using more water, and conventionally that's going to be through damming those river systems. And that reduces flows downstream, and we now know that reducing flows is going to reduce all of these other parts of the food production system to the point where they may cease to be viable. And in one catchment, we've actually gone further, and we've taken our hydrological models that came from our research with our economic models, with the information on food harvesting, and we've modelled what future scenarios might look like with, say, a 5% increase in agricultural production. What does that mean for the range of different users in the system? And we found that under a scenario of using high water use crops, so this is potentially the worst case scenario, but a 5% increase in agriculture would generate an increase in income for Indigenous people in the catchments. But it's only a 6% increase. And for non-Indigenous people, they get twice the benefit, but then it's still only a 12% increase relative to the massive cost. To achieve that, we've got to reduce the flows by something like 65%, and that will impact on the preferred habitat for those fish by something like 90%. So Aboriginal people have a great deal to lose from these sorts of conventional irrigation developments, and they don't really have a lot to gain from it. So what we've found is that food production is not just about agriculture in these systems. Although the discourse is linked to the moral argument about producing food to really give primacy to agriculture as a water user, that rhetoric ignores the hidden components of the food production systems, and it ignores their water needs. So what we're suggesting is that we really need to reframe this debate around the multiple and interdependent food production systems in these systems. And that, we think, will help to avoid the polarised debate, which is usually put forward around environment versus production. And that environment versus production really ignores the other values, and it ignores the interdependencies of these different parts of the food production systems. And it also assumes that environmental allocations, environmental flows, are an unproductive use of water, which clearly isn't the case. So we're hoping that we will make it clear that water in these systems definitely isn't going to waste. The water that's flowing out to these seas is already being used. It's already being used to support really important parts of the food production system. It's just that those systems until now have been poorly understood, they haven't been well valued, and so it's been very easy to trade those off against conventional development. Thanks
Very much. Well, we've got time for a couple of quick questions. Mike?
Just a question on your on the people of the river. I have seen this applied in a number of cases, and it does quite often seem to exclude benefits from rivers to people who are not next to the river. And so you benefit 100 or a community of 180, and a community of 20,000 is without employment just across the way. And I wonder how you balance the interests of the small community, the tourism that might enjoy that, Barramundi fishing, and environmental protection against livelihoods if you're talking about the anthropology of the river. Because very often the people who benefit may not be formally of the river, and in a sense this approach denies them the potential benefits.
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. It's quite a difficult one. So, Sue, what would you think on that? The beauty of collaboration. I should say, though, that we did this work at a basin scale, so we did take into account both the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous people living in the whole of the catchment. And so we attempted to at least scale up to just beyond the benefits that are derived for those the small Indigenous communities along the river system. The economic model took into account the flows in and outside of the entire basin. So, but we didn't look, in the model I put forward, we didn't look at outside of the individual basin, though.
Well, I think drawing the line around beneficiaries is going to be hard in any situation. You've got some of those Aboriginal communities living right on the river, but they're trading with communities many, many hundred kilometres away, or bartering. So where you draw the line is very difficult. You've also got a tourism sector that comes from all parts of the world, so there are beneficiaries everywhere. But the problem we've got at the moment is that these kinds of benefits just aren't even on the table. They're invisible to discussions. And so there does need to be debate at multiple scales about how you balance these things and integrate better in your decision making. But until you do the work, you've got to get that information on the table so that at least it can be taken into account.
There was one other component to the work that we did that I didn't talk about today, where we surveyed people living in the catchments, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and then also people living in capital cities in southern Australia as well, and gave them a list of an opportunity to put forward what they saw as their preferences for the future of those rivers in northern Australia. And quite surprisingly, the order of preference for all of them was the same. And so whether people were living in the catchment, whether they were Indigenous or non-Indigenous, it was the same. And so it was an overwhelming number of people who saw the future of Northern Australia's rivers. The most important use was for conservation and for the use of tourism and for supporting Aboriginal people who lived in the region. And then there were some who saw it as for local food production, but when given an opportunity to choose between a high level of food production, medium or low, they would choose for a medium level. And then development at all costs was the lowest. So it was something like less than 3% of Australians wanted to see these rivers become something like the food bowl for the rest of the world, which is completely at odds with the political rhetoric, which is all around we need to make this the biggest food bowl in Australia.
All right, just a really quick one.
You mentioned that, you said that 30% of the land is under Aboriginal control.
Yep.
Is it something that can have a legal impact on the conundrum that you presented to us?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
Are there Aboriginal rights? Are there Aboriginal rights that would have an influence on the way that this plays out?
Yes, well, there's a very strong form of title in one of the jurisdictions, a freehold title. So that means that those Aboriginal communities have the right to preclude any form of development. So they have a right of consent, and that has a bearing on land use, but there are no recognised rights of commercial use of water. Okay, so we'll wrap up that session. Thank you very much, Michael. Now, our next speaker... Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Anderson, and she is from the Florida International University. She's a conservation ecologist and the Director of International Research. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I just would like to start my talk by extending a special thanks to Sue Jackson and Michael Douglas and Rebecca Thorne. Interestingly, I am coming from the East Coast of the United States, but I heard about this conference and I was able to attend this event thanks to support from my Australian and South African colleagues. And so for me, that's just a really good example of the opportunities for collaboration internationally around water resources issues. And it's really wonderful to be here this week and to be learning about so many different parts of the country, my country, but also the world. So my talk is going to be about rivers and people in the Neotropics. This is not the region I'm from, as you may have guessed, but it is the region where I have lived and worked for most of the past 20 years. And I'm going to specifically give you 2 case studies of ways that social and ecological information were combined for excuse me, environmental flows in river management, one from Honduras in Central America and one from the Amazon Basin of South America. And I would argue that whether you are from this neotropical region, which as far as I can tell in this audience, there's at least one person, our Brazilian colleague that spoke this morning, whether you maybe have been here on vacation or been here for work, or whether this is your first introduction to what is the Neotropics and you'll probably never go there. This is a region that has importance at a global scale, and I'm going to tell you a little bit why before I get into my case studies. So the Neotropics is highlighted here in green on my map, and it's basically the American tropics, so Central and South America and the Caribbean. And one of the things that I think is really unique about this region is that the Neotropics and neotropical rivers in particular are frontiers for new scientific discovery. And so neotropical freshwater fishes are an incredibly diverse group. So far, we have documented 5,600 species of neotropical freshwater fishes. So as somebody who studies fishes and really is interested in freshwater fishes, this for me is really incredible. And you can just see a little bit on this slide, just the diversity in body forms of these species, but also life histories, flow needs, follow suit along those lines. Why is this important to somebody who's never going to the Neotropics? Well, if you look at this graph, you can see that teleosts are bony fishes, right? So freshwater fishes are the most diverse group of vertebrates, and neotropical regions or neotropical rivers and lakes have the world's kind of concentration of species richness in freshwater fishes. So of the 14,000-ish freshwater fishes that have been described worldwide, about 40% of those are in the Neotropics. But when I say this is an area that is really a frontier for new discovery, this is what the sort of kind of how we could depict the growth in knowledge in neotropical fishes over time, what it looks like. So if you look at me, and I consider myself relatively young, but in my lifetime, which let's say the 1976 through now, we have described more than half of the species that we know. And in the past 10 years alone, we've described 1,000 species of neotropical freshwater fishes. And if you look at the graph, you can see that we haven't even come near to hitting an asymptote. So this is an area that if you're looking to get into biological discovery, you should focus here, or you could, where it's just a really important region of the world in terms of scientific discovery. Now, second, another reason why I think this region and its rivers are really important is that neotropical rivers are increasingly being altered by dams and water diversions. And Rebecca got into a little bit of this in her talk when she talked about this global boom in hydropower dam construction that's going on now. Let's see where the laser. Does this have a laser on it? Yeah, the center button. That's really weak. Okay, I won't try to use it then. So I guess what I want you to look at in this map are a few things. First is if you look at Central and South America, you can see that in blue are dams that are under construction and in red are dams that are planned. And this is one of the regions in the world that has some of the highest concentrations of dams both under construction and planned at this time. You can see that a lot of the tropics also follows these same patterns. Somebody who spoke this morning about Australia kind of summed up a little bit about what's happening globally, saying that in Australia, all the good dam sites have been taken, and so people aren't really building dams there anymore. And I would argue that the United States, based on this map and what a lot of you work on and know, is similar. So a lot of the kind of technology and know-how is now being exported to tropical countries. So the companies that are building these new dams are bringing experience from these other places, sometimes good, sometimes could be better. But there are connections. The other thing that I think is important here is that if you look at this graph in the top right corner, you can see that, when I was in grad school, and even now we talk about the 1950s to the 70s as being this heyday of dam building. Well, we're about to have to rewrite history on that if some of these predictions come true. Because since 2000 and basically this decade, starting in 2010, up until what would be 2030, on that graph will be the new heyday of dam construction when we start talking about this in another decades from now. So bringing us back to the Neotropics, I want to give you examples from the specific parts of that region that I'm going to talk about later. One is Central America, and this was my dissertation research where I looked at hydropower development in Costa Rica between 1990 to about 2003. And this was one of the first neotropical countries to really push dam construction very quickly. They built over 30 dams in the 1990s, and you may say, well, that's not a big number. But Costa Rica is a country of about 4.5 million people. It's 1/4 the size of Florida. So it's tiny, and that was a lot of change for rivers in a really short time period. And then over the past decade, they have doubled their generation capacity. Now, when we look at a place like the Amazon, and we see also these trends of very rapid development, one of my current research projects is trying to quantify fragmentation of the Andean Amazonian headwaters by damming. And just this information is kind of hot off the presses, but right now there are 97 dams either existing or under construction in the Andean Amazon region, and another 160 planned. So in yellow here are the planned dams, and in red are the existing or under construction. So you might be asking yourself, well, what is motivating all of this? And what's different? And yeah, these regions already have some dams, so why are we talking about this all again? And I think it's that we're seeing a much different set of trends driving developments, and we're seeing this whole era of mega projects in a lot of neotropical countries. And so what's changing is the size and the number of projects, and that big dams and other water infrastructure projects are being seen as centerpieces of national growth. There are a lot of regional interlinking strategies. One of them that's not really kind of high dams for hydro, but it's also a major water infrastructure operation is the Nicaragua Canal, which is on and off the table every few years. And then there's a big increasing role of Brazil and China in financing and in internationalization. And you could say that the US plays a part in this as well. So kind of globalization of dam building. And then third about the neotropics is that the biodiversity and ecosystem costs of neotropical dams and water diversions are high. And so we talk about ecosystem services, and one that's very important, particularly in the Amazon, is fisheries. And many of the Amazon species that are really important for fisheries are also migratory fishes. So some of these fishes basically migrate from the Amazon estuary all the way up into the Andean headwaters. So these are 3,000 kilometer migrations annually or every few years. And so these are things that would be impeded by dams. Also just, we think about transportation, we think about waste assimilation as typical ecosystem services. But if you were to just drive around different neotropical countries, you would see people using rivers in a lot of different diverse ways that sometimes doesn't get captured well. So here's a picture from Ecuador. Here's another picture from Ecuador. These are common scenes, though, that you see in that region. There are a lot of places in the Amazon where there aren't roads that go across, or bridges that go across rivers, so there are numerous kinds of ferries. It's a very sophisticated one. They range in their kind of safety and technology. But also, if you just start talking to people, this is a quote from one of my neighbors when I lived in Central America that told me, I've lived off transportation, fishing, learned to swim in rivers. My grandparents enjoyed the river. I want to protect it for future generations. So there's a strong kind of personal connection to a lot of these landscapes where people live. So given this whole context of the Neotropics, what can be done and what's happening now? And I just want to tell you two stories that stand out to me from my own work of management responses in this context and ways we can protect and manage rivers better. The first is going to be from Honduras, and the second from Peru and the upper Amazon. So first, the Patuca River in Honduras drains to the Caribbean Sea. This is one of the longest rivers in Honduras and in Central America. And it's also the lower basin of the Patuca is one of the largest roadless wilderness areas in Central America as well. And so if you see this kind of blue blob here, this is a predicted impoundment of a dam that has been on the books, off the books since the 1970s, known as Patuca 3. And in about 10 years ago, there was a really unique collaborative effort between the Nature Conservancy and the Honduran Institute for Electricity to try to come up with an environmental flow regime for this dam. And so one thing that is common to a lot of neotropical systems is that there just isn't a whole lot of data about this region. Even basic flow data just don't really exist. What there is in this region, though, is a lot of traditional ecological knowledge. And so for the environmental flow assessment, there was several months or even a little bit more than a year of collaboration with some of the indigenous groups that live in that area, which are the Tawaka and the Mosquito tribes. And so using a combination of ecological data and field sampling and also local data, we came up with ways that we could try to come up with an environmental flow regime for that river. So what we tried to do was get around some of the data gaps by using the indigenous knowledge. So instead of just asking people, we did annotation of photos where we could take different reference events that people knew where, what were the areas, the flows they needed or the water levels, let's say, they needed for transportation, which was this red line here. What were the areas that, or the flows that they thought were important for reptiles? What was kind of the common, water level during the wet season? And then this Hurricane Mitch here was there in everybody's memory. That was the biggest flood that had ever come. And so they used those as gauges. And then what we came up with, though, was that there were really critical points along the Patuca River that were really important for the people that lived there. Their only way of moving between their towns and communicating was by these canoes that move up and down river. And at dry periods or dry times in the year, there are critical points. They have times it's difficult for them to move the canoes. And what we realized after doing these different exercises was that if we could just secure enough water so that they could always move their canoes, even in the presence of the dam, then we were probably going to have enough water for the other aspects of the system, the ecological aspects that we also wanted to protect. And so the environmental flow recommendations that we came up with actually wouldn't change the dam operations a whole lot, but would mean a lot for protection of the Patuca River and the people's lives that depended on it. The difference was really the time to fill the reservoir. And so, there were a lot of lessons for other neotropical basins that came out of that case. One was that, an environmental flow assessment can be a kind of biological and social inventory, opportunity to collect data, stimulate more science. And that this was one of the first cases that I was involved in that showed the importance of traditional ecological knowledge and understanding these flow ecology relationships as well with those photos, and that we could have observations of the river over generations and where its levels were in the absence of any quantitative data. And then focusing on a key ecosystem service and setting the recommendation for e-flows. There were relatively estimations of simple estimations of what was needed to move the canoes that we could use to figure out what flows were needed to be maintained downstream from the dam. Now, after this project, everybody was very happy, the Nature Conservancy, the Honduran Energy Electricity Company. And I wish I could say, like, the story ended there and the flows were implemented. But this is where I say, like, understanding what's happening in this region is important. So the funding source for this project saw the results of this and said, we shouldn't dam this river. And so they decided not to fund it. But a couple of years later, a Chinese development company said, this is a great place for a dam, so we're going to now develop this river. And a lot of the work that had been done was then not incorporated into the new plans for the dam. And so for me, it was a huge professional lesson learned of you can't just stop there, and you have to have this, you got to tell these stories to a broader audience. And you know, one of the people that came up and spoke from that region when the new plans were coming up just said, you know, I don't get it. We went through all of this work to tell our stories, and you know, this is what he's saying in this quote was that, you know, to everybody outside, they always get the money, the dólares, and then for us, it's always a lot of pain. And it was kind of poetic in terms of Spanish, the way that those words are similar. But it's, you know, it was a lesson that then, now in this next case I'm going to talk about, we are trying to take that into heart. So kind of to end the Honduras chapter, that dam is now under construction as of this year. Let's hope that some of this information is going to be incorporated and you know, used in the future. The second case I just want to talk about quickly is the Marañon River, which is shared between Ecuador and Peru. And this is the part of the major headwaters of the Amazon. So this is this turquoise basin right here. And just in that basin, there are 35 dams existing or under construction and another 82 that are being planned. And some of those rivers kind of where dams have been built are essentially dry for certain sections. Beyond that, you know, the Marañon is also an area that is going to have a hydro via along, that's supposed to be part of this regional plan of interlinking different parts of South America. So it's another kind of major development infrastructure project that's happening in this region. And so, you know, why is this important? Well, so this Marañon River has what's known as the Grand Canyon of the Amazon. So this is what it looks like. It's a very gorgeous landscape. It's also a place where a lot of the species that I was talking about that have been described recently are coming from. These are all different kinds of migratory catfishes in this picture. But more and more, what's coming out beyond just the typical river ecosystem services that are being documented are stories of the really tight linkages between the people who live in this basin and rivers. So the Peruvian Shawi that live in the upper Marañon have kind of a really important role for freshwater in their cosmology. So this is what it looks like in their area where they live. It's beautiful. But their practice for kind of starting their day is to get into rivers that bring water from the high Andes and to do this kind of bathing pre-dawn and splash, and that's the way that they get energy for the day and connect with their ancestors. So the way that they explain it is that if we can't do this, we can't start the day. We don't have the energy. It's something that is very important for them, but it relies on having rivers that they can get in that are safe, that have some connections. And so figuring out ways to protect and incorporate this into river planning is something we're really working on now. Just one other quick example is another indigenous group close downstream is the Cucama, who live along the Marañon River and travel up and down in small boats. And they, you know, they have this belief that for people who drown in the river, if their bodies are not recovered, they're still very much alive. They live in underwater cities. And those underwater cities have schools and are connected with the above water cities through dreams. And these are, you know, these are very real things for these communities and things that aren't always considered very well in the current framework for considering new developments. And so with this particular, these initiatives in the Marañon, there are several different groups that are working on trying to predict scenarios with damming, trying to document these culture, flow, ecology linkages, and trying to use this information in a way that combines ecological and social information for kind of better river planning in this system. So in summary, if you take things away from my talk, the first is that the Neotropics is a region in the midst of rapid and irreversible change. Rivers, their biodiversity, and the human populations that depend on them are at the center of much of that change. Management and conservation responses really need to consider ecological and social information together. And then sometimes the socio-cultural river linkages offer the strongest arguments for protecting ecosystems and environmental flows. So I just want to say thank you, and it's really wonderful to be at this conference.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Just time for one quick question from the audience, if anyone has any particular question. Okay, we might move on then back to Rebecca, who's going to be presenting 2 cases from Africa for us. Thank you very much, Rebecca.
You're going to do that. I have no idea where it is otherwise. Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to present a couple of cases from the region where I grew up, although the cases really are the work of a great number of colleagues of mine other than myself. I've been a little bit engaged in one of the 2 that I'll present. So please do bear that in mind. There are a couple of my colleagues in the audience who can answer the tough questions. But I'm going to really talk a little bit about some of the experience from Africa. So we have some regional balance and perspective in this session. And I'm going to start really with the backdrop. Both the case studies involve Tanzanian and Kenyan water resources legislation and policy. I think in this room there are probably a number of people who are familiar with it. It modeled very strongly, very closely on the South African water law and the policy around water, the rights to law for basic human needs, and the rights to law, the 2 rights to law, the other being for the environment, the reserve. So Tanzania and Kenya both took the ideas from the South African water law and really modeled their reformation of water law and policy along those lines. We don't need to go through all of this except to say that it's very clearly and visibly in the legislation that the environment is an important component to consider in water resource planning, development and allocation. And that it's very important to make that connection between the ecological needs and the social needs of communities. And if you look at the timeline, a lot of this policy legislation is very recent. And just to bear that in mind, that the evolution of the science and the practice of environmental flows is also fairly recent in this region, again, building very much on the experience that's come out of other countries such as South Africa. So I'll start with the first case study for the Rufiji Basin in Tanzania. This is not a transboundary basin. It's fully within the Tanzanian boundaries. And the focus of this assessment was really around providing support for water resources for the environment, but with particular attention to the needs of neighboring human communities. And the context was the development of potential for future water resource development, should I say, in Tanzania, particularly with projected irrigation expansion, including the agricultural growth corridor. So if we look at the basin, I won't go into the details of the context of the basin, but it's as I say, within the boundaries of Tanzania. There are a number of other large river basins that comprise the country, but the Rufiji is the largest. It's also the focus of their integrated water resource management and planning process at the moment, and through what they're using the Rufiji Basin is essentially a test case for extrapolation of the learning to the other basins for which they also need to develop their integrated water resources management plans. And the focus of the work that's been done on environmental flows that I'll be discussing is in the Kilombero sub-basin, which is right here in the central area of the Rufiji. I mentioned earlier today holistic environmental flow assessment, and in line with the learning that came out of South Africa and the close relationships between people and local communities that depend on natural resources in these river basins, The process that was undertaken really was to adopt some of the methodological procedures that have been used in South Africa and are routinely used now for establishing the ecological reserve for South African rivers, particularly once we go below the planning level into more comprehensive assessment. And so that's a science-based process, scoping, preparation for the environmental flow, interdisciplinary, gathering of people that I mentioned earlier to come together and work out what are the flow needs for the ecosystem and for directly dependent communities in this case. And then there's the negotiation phase, development of scenarios, re-examining those scenarios and so on. What's important to note is throughout this process, stakeholder engagement is critical, and there may be different groups of stakeholders coming in and out of the process, but it's fundamentally a part, that social process is fundamentally a part of this environmental flow determination. In this case, the methodology used was one that's quite well established and routinely applied in South Africa, and it really looks at building up month by month across the year recommended flows that we know have particular connections between the people in the river basin and their direct dependencies on the flow dynamics of the system, and the ecological function and structure of the system as well. Two scenarios, the government of Tanzania, and particularly the water board of this basin, wanted to really look at two scenarios. Current development scenario for the basin, the target scenario, but then also additional use. If we were to further develop the water resources in the future, what might be the scenario in terms of the environmental water needs? So that involved a process of developing low flow and floods recommendations with motivations, ecological and social motivations for those recommendations for these two scenarios. That amounted to about 70 different kinds of flow events that have very detailed recommendations of why those flows are important for the ecosystem and for people, and that can be drawn upon in the discussions with stakeholders and in the assessment, the implementation and compliance monitoring to meet the regulatory needs for the reserve in Tanzania. What was interesting in this, in the Kilombero environmental flow assessment, was the socioeconomic process. It was quite well developed. Many environmental flow studies in the region have had social sciences integration, but this one was really a fundamentally significant part of the environmental flow assessment. It involved a number of methodologies some of you are possibly familiar with around participatory rural appraisals with communities. A large number of communities spread across the basin were consulted, were engaged with, had discussions, and were part of the environmental flow assessment to really get the best understanding and as quantitatively as possible of what their relationships were with the Kilombero River floodplain system. At the same time, a number of eco-hydrological surveys were also undertaken. I won't talk about those, but of course the same kinds of surveys were being done for water quality, for fisheries, for riparian vegetation, and so on. And it was quite clear that there are a number of riverine resource services, as in the case in the Daly River, that were very important to the lives of people. The river floodplain system in the central part of this basin is really critical even for the supply of domestic water to some communities that don't have any other direct water supply. So they're using water directly from the river in some of the places along the river system. In other places not. They're relying on groundwater, which is a very poorly understood resource. Fishing, recession, agriculture. What is interesting about agriculture in this area is that it's rice and maize predominantly and some other crops. But a lot of that agriculture is actually still flood recession linked. In other words, it relies on the nutrition, the sediments, the nutrients, and the waters coming from and to the river to maintain that cultivation over time. Also, a number of rituals associated with the river, and cultivated wild vegetables and other resources that are linked to the timing and pattern of flows. One of the parts of the process that's quite well developed in Southern Africa, but hadn't been used very much in the assessments before in this region, was understanding up front what were the ecological and social importance values and sensitivities of the various sites along the river system, and what was the current environmental state or ecological state of the system and its future environmental management class. If you're familiar with the South African case, there is a classification system for the resources in terms of their importance, their sensitivity, their trajectories of change, and the stakeholders' perspectives and what they think this river system should be managed for in the future, because the environmental flows are set for stakeholder desired condition. It's not the role of the science to say what the environmental flow should be, but the evidence base then supports the discussion with stakeholders of what kind of river or what kind of river floodplain they would like to see in the future in their area. And social sciences input is not commonly used in that kind of classification, but it was in the Rufiji, to sort of get a sense of the relative importance socially of some of these sites along the river system. You saw the Trinity River, California flow conceptual model. I showed it earlier, the Eco-Hydrological model. In the case of the Quilombeira River floodplain system, based on the social surveys that I mentioned earlier, we were able to build conceptual models of the relationships between the pattern of flows characteristic of this river system and the life cycles of the fauna of the system, the flora of the system, but also the human community. So this orange box at the top is that intimate dynamic between the way people live and work and manage their access and use of resources and the pattern and timing of flow. So we were able to actually develop those conceptual relationships with the social dimensions. We're able to then calculate the environmental flow needs. I won't go into the process for that, but we're able to look at the average. This is one of the sites in the basin. The maintenance year average flow in the river, the blue line, and the average flow conditions under a normal drought situation, and then what the recommended flows were lower, but still fairly similar between drought and maintenance years. What has then been done is really to go into the scenario stage early on, just to get a sense of, well, with planned irrigation development, what are going to be some of the challenges that we can see in terms of the projections for water, for irrigation, and for the environment. And if we look at one example for one of the river systems, there's some planned irrigation. Without irrigation, here we have the blue area is where the flows would actually be above what's recommended as the maintenance environmental flow. The green is between the maintenance and the drought recommendations, and anything orange is below the recommended drought environmental flow recommendation. We can see even naturally there's some areas where the environmental flows are not met during a drought situation, which would be quite normal in the natural case as well. But with irrigation, with one of these scenarios of irrigation in place, percentage of time below that would increase. It would be particularly obvious during the dry periods, which is when there are some critical needs of people in relation to water quality, human health aspects of the river, navigation, and so on. And so you can start to see how the scenarios with stakeholders very quickly pinpoint where there might be some challenges in terms of meeting the needs of both the environment and the people that depend on it and the irrigation sector. I'll move on quickly to the Mara River Basin. It's the second case study. There's been quite a long history of environmental flow determination in the Mara. It's a transboundary basin between Kenya and Tanzania. It starts off in the Mau Escarpment on the Kenyan side. Mostly forested area, the water towers of the basin, smallholder agriculture, moving into large-scale agriculture area, down into the Masai Mara, and then across the border into the Serengeti, where the location of the major wildebeest and other migration, largest overland migration in the world now of animals. So strong conservation focus and ecotourism focus here, and into some wetlands on the shores of Lake Victoria. So it's part of the Nile Basin and part of the Nile Basin initiative, this catchment. There's been environmental flow assessment that's run in parallel with the water resources legislation development and the allocation and planning frameworks. Those two processes have run and intersected at various times. So just to give a timeline of that, so there have been projects that have looked at the health, human health and biodiversity across those two basins, environmental flow assessments done only on the Kenyan side, others that have started to look at environmental flow needs on both sides. And it's only very recently that there's been a memorandum of understanding signed between the two countries for transboundary management in the Mara River Basin. So that has set the stage for environmental flow assessment that's transboundary, using some of the best practice techniques in this area. And I just sort of highlight some examples from the Mara that I think are a little bit interesting to look at. One is only on the Kenyan side, there is a water resource classification system. Such a system is not yet in place at all on the Tanzanian side. On the Kenyan side, in terms of understanding the relative importance of different parts of the river ecosystem, it's the ecological importance, the livelihoods importance, and the commercial importance that are all taken into consideration. So the classification system brings in social dimensions and livelihoods explicitly. As I showed with the refugee, there's strong dependencies between resource use and the flow regimes of the Mara River system. And I won't go into the details of it, but there are very specific relationships between the resources that people depend on and their accessibility and condition, both in the low flow times of the year and the high flow times of the year for various resources. And this is based on a number of surveys with communities in different parts of the basin on either side. And then I think what's interesting is in these new two areas that are developing, I think, in the Mara environmental flow field now. One is on really integrating the land use component into the environmental flow decision making. So this is one of the tools, one of the methods that's out there that is being used. It's risk-based, it's probabilistically based, and it really just, but I'm obviously not going to go into the detail of this, but it basically the yellow boxes are issues to do with land use management, and the blue boxes are to do with flow management. So those are the places, the blue is where we can use environmental flows to influence decisions. They map right through with the stresses and key components of the ecosystem and the communities, right through to the basic human needs of the reserve and the ecological component of the reserve. The two parts that are going to be gazetted in the gazetted in the legislation. And the environmental flow discussion with stakeholders looks at probabilistically, if you were to alter some of these relationships between dependencies on flow and geomorphology or fisheries and so on, how might you influence this network of probabilities, and what might it do to your ecological risk or your risk of not meeting the basic human needs for people? So that's an area of evolution in the environmental flow science I think is particularly interesting, and it's very fruitful in that it brings together stakeholders into the discussion and they can interactively explore scenarios and probabilities. The other, and the last one that I'll focus on, is on the adaptive management process. It's a weak area in terms of implementation of environmental flows. It's really to put the flows in the river and start to look at what are the implications. Have we got the environmental flow recommendations right? Have we over or underestimated them? What happens if development takes a different path? And so there is real focus now on developing the monitoring protocol for the Mara Basin specifically. And one of the challenges is really in identifying some of the social indicators. We're having to use ecological surrogates, or where we know there are ecological links with social dependency. For example, flow-dependent fish species that are important for communities as a source of market or opportunity for trade, or important in their diet, they can be very good indicators. But how do we build that into a realistic monitoring system that can engage stakeholders at different levels to track whether the reserve, once it does get gazetted and starts to be implemented, is really meeting its objectives and is effectively ensuring compliance at a legal level. I'll leave it there. Thanks. I don't know if there's a time for a question or any questions.
We do have time. Yes, sir.
Yes, with respect to the refugee studies that you did, was there participation from the Refugee Basin Water Office or Refugee Basin Development Authority?
Yes, and I would say it's the work of a team of people that includes the Refugee Basin Water Board. And actually, we'll be back there next week having a specific conversation with the Refugee Basin Water Board on what are the most useful next steps to be taken in that basin, given the pressures in terms of the socioeconomic development pressures around irrigation and food security issues in that particular basin. The science that's shown just how strongly resource-dependent communities are there, more than 90% dependency still on the naturally functioning system. And so we'll be having a conversation on really how to most effectively use the knowledge that's come out of this process in their water resource basin planning. At the moment, it's very timely. The Refugee Basin Integrated Water Resource Development Plan is out there, and it's just had its final stakeholder consultation. It's integrated environmental flows at a very coarse level, at a desktop level, but without ecological and social information underpinning that. And now we are able to bring in some of this more in-depth information to really highlight where in the refugee basin as a bigger picture basin, the entire basin, we might need to focus more attention in terms of understanding the flow, environment, and user needs more closely. One of the challenges, of course, is a common challenge to everybody is the lack of of really good hydrological data in this basin, both surface water and groundwater, and how to manage this kind of process in such a data limited context. But I think this assessment showed it's possible to actually go quite far in a very data poor environment. Thank you for that question.
One more question.
I'm wondering, like the Mara watershed goes to Lake Victoria, which obviously is heavily impacted. Are you extending deep flows to not just river and the riparian area to major water bodies like Lake Victoria?
Yes, and I think one of the challenges is scaling up and bringing together some of these efforts on environmental flows, which have been, I think, up to now fairly disparate, but are starting to really coalesce. And the Nile Basin Initiative and the framework for thinking about the water allocation planning for the Nile as a whole is really almost, I think, become a vehicle for how to bring these different efforts together. The Mara assessment, the link to Lake Victoria, and there have been some environmental flow assessments around, Lake Victoria that are focused on the lake system, and then of course there's been a lot of discussion on other areas of the White and Blue Nile at this time. So there are recognized gaps in the framework that's been put out there in it's just been put out now for the Nile Basin on how to better manage the allocation of water resources, including environment and social needs across the basin. So there's real attention now on exactly this, how to make sure that not only Lake Victoria, but other parts of the system are considered. And a lot of people don't really see those interconnections. But I think in the field of environmental flows, we are now really looking at these larger landscape scales and having to really take the knowledge we've gained from these various places and use it, deploy it to places where we have nothing, at least to get a precautionary sense of what might be the environmental water needs.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Okay, our next speaker, last speaker, is Dr. Joe Flodermosh from the US EPA. So he's bringing us back to the US for our last case study. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue. I think Rebecca's talk left off at a very nice point to introduce you to why I'm involved with this group. For the past 2 decades, I've been working with bioassessment and monitoring techniques for large and great rivers. And as those methods have progressed, I began to start becoming more involved with environmental flow groups who were trying to put different measures in place of what type of success are we having. We have these goals, are they working? And as part of that, I've had to become more aware of the process of environmental flows. What I'm going to be presenting today is my understanding of flows from someone who has to work with this group and how I interact with them. I specifically work in the Office of Research and Development, and I support people like Lisa, who's my co-author, in our regional office, who are the people in EPA that really work with the states and tribes. So if we're going to talk about environmental flows in the United States, you really need to start with a basic understanding of the Clean Water Act, which is the primary rule in the United States that the EPA uses for working with environmental flows. In this presentation, I'll try to give you a brief overview of the Clean Water Act's authority to address flow, provide a few examples from both states and tribes. And when I speak about tribes, those of you all that live here will know this, but that includes bands, nations, rancheros, communities, pueblos, and I think right now that's at 566 different groups in the United States. So and they pretty much have a similar authority to states. So it's a sizable group to work with. And I'll provide a few examples of how they're using the authority of the Clean Water Act for social and cultural values. And lastly, I'll also talk about the economic importance that helps to provide incentives to make sure we protect these resources for cultural uses. So the goals of the Clean Water Act, when people hear about the Clean Water Act, when I talk to them out in the field or on a river, they primarily think about it as a tool that's used to reduce pollution in rivers and streams. And that's true, but it also is to maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the waters of the nation. And this includes addressing pollution as it's defined in the Clean Water Act, where it says the man-made or man-induced alteration of the chemical, physical, and biological and radiological integrity of waters. And if you just look at the words I've highlighted, it's man-induced alterations to the physical integrity of water. So the Clean Water Act really does apply to include environmental flows as well. Water quality standards are really the standards that are used in the Clean Water Act to address environmental flows. And a lot of these terms will be something you're familiar with, but I'm going to try to break them down and show you how they fit together a little bit. The first one is designated uses, and these really set the goals for the water body, such as fishing, swimming, recreation, aquatic life protection. A common phrase people hear is that water is supposed to be fishable and swimmable, according to the Clean Water Act. The second piece of the water quality standards is the narrative or numeric criteria. It sets the criteria necessary to protect the uses. And you may hear someone say, well, we don't want a certain chemical to be higher than this certain level in the water. Or it could be a narrative where it doesn't have a number, and I'll have an example about how that fits in. Lastly is anti-degradation, and it protects existing uses. So there's a difference between designated uses and anti-degradation with their existing uses, and we'll touch on those a little bit more in a second. So as I've explained, the water quality standards are the backbone of implementing the Clean Water Act, and states and tribes are responsible for setting the standards. It's not something U.S. EPA does. They help provide a framework, and we also work to help identify ways to set the standards and support setting the standards, but we ourselves, the EPA, does not do that. And it's used both for criteria and protecting uses. And the states and tribes have tremendous flexibility in identifying what those uses and criteria are. But one of the things I work with is to make sure when they set something, I try to help and make it as defensible as possible with the development of robust assessment and monitoring approaches. So we'll dive a little bit more into each standard. Designated uses, states and tribes can evaluate what flows are needed to meet their designated uses. For instance, if they have a designated use for aquatic life, what flow regime is needed to support that? I talked about designated uses. They equal desired uses is another word you may hear. And that's different from existing uses, which will be the third one I talk about in a second. Criteria, if we look how it applies specifically to flows, states and tribes can set narrative or numeric criteria. For example, the flow needs to protect shellfish harvesting, or the flow needed to protect restoration. They can also use basic chemical criteria that is affected by flow. And that is, for example, dissolved oxygen temperature or biological criteria, and make sure the flow supports those criteria. Lastly is anti-degradation. And this is used quite a bit in the United States, but it's also common in a lot of other countries where they have something that's in relatively good condition and they do not want to see it decline. And anti-degradation, they can ensure that existing uses of high-quality waters are not removed, including the flow needed to meet those uses. So what I've got here in the bottom right-hand corner is a map of the United States that shows some of the states and tribes with explicit flow criteria. And I went back and forth about putting this figure up because it's very debatable, but this is from a document that's in review right now. And it's out for public review right now, so it is something that's been published. The orange stars are tribes and the red ones are states. And if one of the things you'll notice about this is that all these cases are in the eastern United States and there's none in the western United States. And I almost took the explanation out of why this is, but I'm happy after hearing Oliver and Amy and Tony and Adrian this morning that I left this in, because it was something that when I learned this, I was raised in the East. And when I start working with some people in the West, the pieces didn't fit the same. So we'll look at this in just a little bit more detail. Water rights are governed differently in the United States. And if you work out here, you're very aware of that. In the East, it follows what's called the rule of riparianism, riparian rights. And it's also referred to as English rule, if you've heard that term. And it exists in many jurisdictions, not completely, but in jurisdictions with common law heritage. And some of the pieces that I've found are some places that have common law heritage are Canada and Australia. Doesn't mean that all of Canada or Australia follow that, but English rule does appear there. It limits the use of landowners with riparian land. So if you live near the land, you have a greater right to that water. And what is or is not a reasonable use is defined by the state or tribe through permitting. Now that is in contrast to what we see in the West, which is generally prior appropriation, or what's called American rule. And it's first in time, first in right, which was in the first talk from this morning, if you remember. First user has the right to use the water and excludes those who came later or who may even own the adjacent land. And a couple of the talks today talked about how negotiations are happening and increasingly happening that are starting to challenge this, and it's good. Seniority rule and appropriating water from the river, not land ownership, which means you could buy a piece of property on that land and you don't necessarily have the rights to the water. Tribes might be different because water rights are considered parts of treaties, so it does apply differently, and it can get very complex from what I understand from talking to my colleagues in the regions out here when you have multiple tribes and multiple states interacting on a single basin. So I'll jump into the examples I have. The first one is a Seminole tribe from Florida, and it's an example of where designated use directly states that the goal of the water body is to protect it for cultural and religious significance. And I just love this photo because you have a guy in a nice canoe with an airboat zipping by, and I guarantee there's a scientist there to protect the guy in the canoe ripping around, but it's just a photo I love. All criteria in this case would be designated that to directly protect that use. One of the things I found fascinating about this case, I may be jumping the gun. It's considered a Class 2 water. It's fish and wildlife maintenance of a well-balanced population of fish and wildlife recreation in and on the water. And the subcategory is cultural and religious significance. One of the things that's unique about this example is that it's protected for cultural and religious significance, but because the religious significance and cultural significance is considered private information, they don't have to say what that is. It's protected information by the tribe. So it doesn't have to explicitly say in the rules what those religious or cultural significance is. The second one is from Tennessee, where a lot of my family lives. It's a state with wide use of rivers and streams for a myriad of recreation, and it specifically protect for flows for cultural and social uses. And this case gets a lot of attention because of some of the language in it. And it's considered a Class 3 water in Tennessee law for fish and aquatic life, and the flows, stream or other water body flows, shall support fish and aquatic life criteria for recreation, and the flow stream follows the shall support recreational use. So it's a narrative criteria. So it's words. How do you interpret it? How do you interpret narrative criteria? We don't have a number. Well, this went to court, and how they defended it is when the judge asked, how do you plan on defending this? It says, there needs to be enough flow for 2 canoes, because who wants to canoe alone? Which I just thought, so it's in the record. That's the limit. You have to have enough water for 2 canoes. So why is it important to support these social issues like recreation? Yes, we have the social and cultural, but studies define economic impacts, which are also important to states. And healthy aquatic ecosystems support outdoor tourism and recreation to the tune of about 6.1 million American jobs, $646 billion in outdoor recreation spending, and $39.7 billion in state and local tax revenue. And as far as the state and local tax revenue, Kentucky, for example, Kentucky's Fish and Wildlife Department is totally supported by licenses. So it provides money to local economies and rural areas, and we're noted to be stable even in economic downturns. So when jobs are out, a lot of people are still out recreating and support the communities. This last example I'm going to touch on, is the Bad River Band of the Lake Superior Tribe of Chippewa Indians. And I actually worked with them to help develop their bioassessment monitoring program for rivers. And it's an example of setting criteria that specifically applies to the quantity of water that could affect culturally important uses of the water. In this specific case, it has to do with the river is set up to where you have somewhat confined channels, and then it opens up into big flats where there's expansive rice areas, and then it goes back into a narrow channel, then there's more rice flats. And they go out in canoes, bend it over, and whack it with a stick to have the rice fall on the bottom of the canoe, and they'll come back with several inches of rice that's 2 centimeters long. It's really hard to cook, but it's wonderful. So the water quality and quantity that may limit the growth of propagation of, or otherwise cause or contribute to the adverse effect to wild rice, wildlife, and other flora and fauna of cultural importance to the tribe shall be protected. And the picture I have in the bottom left-hand corner is actually from the Rice Harvest Festival that they have. So this links back to what Rebecca talked about in the opening talk about the Brisbane Declaration Global Act Agenda. How does what I just spoke about actually link back to the Clean Water Act? So it's providing protection of flow, both for aquatic life as well as for social cultural values, directly into state and tribal water quality standard programs is consistent with the Global Action Agenda of the Brisbane Declaration. It's advocated for implementing and enforcing environmental flow standards. And EPA does not require states or tribes to do this where they want to identify their social, culturally important flow regimes. They can use the authority of the Clean Water Act to do so. And a lot of what I've talked about today is contained in this document right here, at least the citations for most of it. And it's currently out for review, but if you just Google US EPA hydrological alterations, this document will come up. It's been a collaborative effort we worked on for several years with USGS to kind of get a state of the science to support states and tribes as they move forward with the development of environmental flow programs. And with that, I'm done.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Joe? Okay. Now, we are back on track, but we had quarantined 10 minutes for time for questions. I just wonder if there is anyone that has any questions, please feel free to ask, or would you like to claim the time back, or if there's any questions about the introduction that we didn't provide some time for, or everyone's happy to go to afternoon tea, it looks like, so might have got us back on time. Oh, one question, yes, great.
I would say the details haven't been successfully worked out. I mean, but we've got to do something. It's the flows out here have been in discussion a lot longer than they have, and there's a lot more history and legal history. But yeah, I think we've got to move in that direction. But it's going to be an interesting thing. It's going to take years. There's a lot of riparian work that's going on right now out west that we're actually using in some other countries, the proper functioning condition. Is that one of the programs you're talking about? Yeah. Where they talk about how restoring the riparian zones actually results in more groundwater being stored. And when the water drops down, it's actually supporting better flow regime during low flow periods. So that's really about all I can speak to on that, is that I know a lot of riparian programs are being seen as ways that are significantly impacting systems during low flow to mitigate some of the problems that we're seeing biologically, at least.
We're getting great money from you folks to address temperature and air rivers by floods.
And there's some really good case studies out in Nevada about the impact of Sherm Swanson. Sherm, he's been doing a lot of work about how some of the riparian areas have drastically altered, improved the temperature of the water and brought some systems back. It's absolutely fascinating, some of the data he's collected over the past 10 years working with landowners.
Have you got a question? I know. Please.
Your question for Joe as well. Is it correct that for tribes to be able to formulate these water quality standards, they need to qualify for treatment as a state within the meaning of the Clean Water Act? And if so, could you talk about the challenges that tribes have faced in gaining that status? Because if I'm right, then getting that status is a predicate to being able to do all the great things that you discussed in your presentation.
I can't answer either one of those with authority, but I can tell you as a scientist, when tribes come to us with questions, there's very little hesitation to work with them. As far as the legal authority from Washington, I can't really speak to that. But I know there's always benefits to being officially recognized, and I think because for me, it definitely makes it a lot easier, because then I can work with the Office of International Tribal Affairs, see what connections they have, and what things we can work out and collectively, and what resources they can bring as far as training materials. At a minimum, they're still citizens of this country, and I work for this country. So,
question at the back, or a response to that?
One before the break. Could you explain to me, sir, given all the science you do, all the activities you undertake, all the different groups in the United States, and all the money you give to so many people, why
Yeah.
Well, with
It's
that,
because our job is to take care of the problems before you even hear about it. So actually, the project I'm working right now is called environmental forecasting, and we're trying to detect problems well in advance before they become an issue and the public even hears about it. So we're trying to anticipate those problems. But the stories growing up for me, I heard about EPA, and I still hear about in the news, are the things that go wrong. And as a government employee, we're not really allowed, it's not part of our job to talk about the things that didn't go wrong or the things that are going right. The specific program I work with right now is the Report on the Environment. One of the charges that I was given on that is to do a better job of telling those stories. And I'll give an example, a non-water example, which is air quality. We have all these indicators that are included in the Report on the Environment where we see declines towards the direction, good declines, and we see improvements in water quality and in air quality. And we also see declines in different diseases and conditions that are related, been directly shown in the literature to be linked to these conditions. So we have great stories to tell. What we've lacked is the venue to really tell those stories. And I've got till May of 2020 to tell that story. So
okay.
I hear what you're saying, and I want to do something to make a difference about that, and I'm in a good position to do that now. So if it's not better, it's my fault.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, with that last comment as an endorsement of good work, I'd like you to all help thank me and thank the presenters for this presentation. Thank you. And